So we're doing Parshas Tazria-Metzora. Tazria begins on 6 to 8, and it says, Hashem says to Moshe, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, tell the Jewish people the following. Isha kis Azria, a woman who comes forth with seed, v'yalda zachar, and she gives birth to a son, v'tama shivas yamim, she is tameh for 7 days, kamei nidas, just like when she was a nida, like when she's menstruating. V'yom hashmini, on the 8th day, yimo basar lasa, on the 8th day you circumcise him. Right? So 7 days unclean, and the mother is spiritually clean after that, and then all of them go and they circumcise the son on the 8th day. Ushloshim yom ushloshos yamim teisha b'dimei tahara, and then she has, as it says this, for 33 days she remains in purity. She should not touch anything sacred, and she may not enter the sanctuary until the completion of these days. Right? These are days to prepare for purity. And then it tells you what happens if the woman then has a girl. It begins on line 5. Vayim nekeva teled, and she gives birth to a daughter, because in the first one was a son. V'tamash uwayim kanidasa v'shisham yom v'shishas yamim. So it says that not only is she considered spiritually unprepared, she's tameh, but her preparation to become tahor is also different. Both are different than from a male. For a male, it starts out pretty simply. It says it's 1 week and 30 days. But for a female, it's 2 weeks and 60 days. So it seems to me that she's being penalized for having a girl. That it's less of an issue. That's what it looks like, right? I mean, she's considered like a nida, like a woman who can't have relations and shouldn't come into contact with her husband physically. She has a boy for 1 week, and she has a girl for 2 weeks, and then to prepare for her to become totally able to go back into the temple and to do everything, it's a boy 30 days and a girl 60 days. So it sounds to me to be a perfect example that the Torah appears to be treating a woman worse for the sin of giving birth to a woman, a girl, rather than to a boy. Doesn't that sounds like that? But if we really want to understand it, let's look at it in a little bit of a deeper light, which the Torah is, of course, trying to say to us. Because on the appearance, this is an example where you find people who are looking for issues with Judaism will often quote this one and say, you see that, how terrible it is? The Torah says that a woman goes and does the terrible sin of giving birth to a girl. She has twice as long to sit separate from her husband than if she gives birth to a boy. Right? So now that is true, it's what it says, but the question is this a penalty? Is this a question of reality? Why is this the case? Why is there a difference? So we go back to the first story of creation of a human being giving birth to a human being. Is the story of Eve or Chava and Cain and Hevel, right? Cain and Abel. Cain is the first one born. So when she goes to give birth to Cain and she gives birth to him, this is the first person in the history of the world to give birth to a baby. Right up until now, God created people. A woman didn't give birth until this was the first one. So it says that she gives birth to Cain, right? And she says to God, I'm going to name him Cain. Why? Ki kanisi ish es Elohim. Because I was kanisi, like Cain, right? A man like God. That is, I created a man like God does. God, up until this point, who created people? God. So now I, a woman, I'm like God. I created a person, and therefore I'm going to name my child in the same way. That's what she's saying, right? So here it's perfectly appropriate. She gives birth to a baby that she's now doing something that only God did before. So she's making a blessing to God that she's able to do this. She created a human being just like God does. So here we have this expression that she's thanks God for her being able to create this child, right? We have an idea of the following concept. What is this thing called tuma and tahara that it refers to here? Tuma is poorly translated as unclean, and tahara is poorly translated as clean, because it has nothing to do with clean and dirty. It has nothing to do with physical. It's a total spiritual thing. A person who is tameh is unable to enter the temple Because they came into contact with one of many different things, of which none of them are bad. For instance, one of the greatest mitzvahs you could do is bury somebody who died. Right? However, if you do that, you become tameh. You can't enter the temple. A person who comes into contact with the dead can't go into the temple. Right? So you see that being tameh is not a punishment or a bad thing. It's like saying you have blue eyes. It's a reality. That's what happens sometimes. And you have to say, why is it that a person becomes tameh? And usually it's because they came into contact with something whose potential was not necessarily fulfilled. So for instance, in the case of menstruation, where you have a woman becomes a nida, right? So what happened there? Menstruation is simply an egg that was not fertilized, and it dies. And so therefore, in the sense of theology, it's an egg that did not reach its potential. Its potential was to become fertilized. Is that a bad thing? No. No woman can get pregnant every month, right? And 12-year-old girls, 11-year-old girls, they have menstruate. Women who aren't even married, women who lost their husbands, women in their 50s, they can still menstruate, and they're not going to have children regularly, right? So it's not an evil, but it's a fact. This egg was put in the world to become a child. It didn't. So now, when that egg leaves, it doesn't fulfill its potential, right? So therefore, there's this tuma, this spiritual inability is left behind. And the more serious the thing is that doesn't reach its potential, the greater the amount of tuma is. So for instance, a woman who's a nida, because the egg wasn't fulfilled, is a low level of tuma. It's not a very serious one. If you come into contact with a dead human, it's an extremely serious one. Now again, it's not a punishment. It's just a higher level of it. Why? Because a human being has a much greater potential than an egg, right? Because an egg is so far away from being a human being than a human being itself. So the human being dying, right, is a loss of great potential. So it's a much higher level of a problem. Right? I know we're dealing with concepts that are not really understood today, but that's the idea behind it. So what happens is, for instance, when a woman menstruates, so inside of her originally there was this egg, right? And it had a potential to make a life, and then it doesn't. So what happens is when that egg comes out, it leaves a vacuum. The vacuum is that it's gone. It's nothing in her womb now. And so in nature hates vacuums. It always wants to fill things. Right? So what does it fill it with? Tuma, this spiritual inability it fills it with. But it's in direct relationship to how much potential there was. So the amount of spiritual ability, the lack of it, in the case of a menstruating woman, is very little. In case of a dead human, is very large. Right? It's because the soul left the person. It's now filled with tuma, and when you come into contact with it, you acquire it. That's how it works. So in the case of a woman who gives birth to a child, so before she gives birth, inside of her is a soul. She has two souls now. She has her soul and the baby's soul. The baby's soul is inside of the baby. It's moving around, right? It's alive. It's just not ready to come out yet. Now it's ready to come out, right? It comes out. What's left behind? A vacuum. So what fills vacuums? Tuma fills vacuums, right? The amount of tuma that's inside fills a vacuum. So the more tuma, the greater the loss was, which means the greater the potential was. Like I said, the greatest amount of tuma comes from a human body that's dead, right? The least amount comes from like an egg. In the case of a woman, it's a very small amount. But compare that to coming in contact with the dead, it's very great. So now we say a woman who gives birth, right? The vacuum is left behind in her womb. It gets filled with tuma. Now, how much tuma? So it says in the case of a boy, 30 days. In the case of a girl, 60 days. So originally we say that means that they're penalized for a girl. But it's now we start to understand it. When it says that Eve gave birth to a son, and she said, "Kanisi ish es Elohim," I have created a baby like God does, right? So now that baby has left her, right? So the potential that was within her of creating a human is done, and the vacuum is left, and the tuma enters, right? That's when she creates a son. But what happens when she creates a girl? When she creates a girl, she's not creating a human. She's creating a creator. Because she just said, I'm like God. I created a baby. I did that. I'm the first human being in the world to create a baby. That's what she does. She gives birth to the baby. So now when she gives birth to a boy, he facilitates that. So he has there's a lot of holiness in a boy. When he leaves, there's a lot of tumah that comes in. But when she gives birth to a girl, she's not just creating a human, she's creating a creator, which is godlike. Which means then when that girl leaves her womb, the holiness of that girl was much greater. And therefore the amount of tumah that enters her womb is much greater. And therefore in the case of a boy, she only has 30 days worth of tumah. In the case of a girl, she has 60 days worth of tumah. So now if we see it in light of this, which is the way the Torah talks, we actually see that she's penalized for having a boy, not for having a girl. Because the less tumah means the less holiness, and the act wasn't as great. The act of a woman creating a woman is a woman creating a creator. A woman creating a male is she's creating a human. Right? A human is great, but a human creator is even greater, right? In light of this. So we actually see it's the opposite of what most people think when we read this. It really turns it on its ear, where people think that here the Torah is saying that women are inferior, and therefore a woman who does the great sin of giving birth to a woman, right, is creating an inferior being, and therefore she's penalized. When it's really the opposite. When she's creating a woman, she's creating a creator. A creator is greater than a human, and therefore the amount of tumah left behind after she does this is going to be greater than it would be if it was just a male. And that's why we have it in such a way. So it's actually, according to our commentaries, the opposite of what one thinks. Now, people will say, oh, this is just what you call apologists. In other words, people say, look at the problem in Judaism. They treat women second class. So we come up with an apologies. Like, we try to fit meaning in to say it's not real. That could be said if what I just said to you was a new answer. Right? Since feminism came around in the 60s, we had to come up with this answer to argue with them. But it's not a new answer. I found this answer in the medieval commentaries, where in the days of the Middle Ages, the Jews' treatment of women was far advanced over any other society. Every other society treated women like belongings. You owned the woman. You didn't educate women. They couldn't read or write. Right? But in Judaism, they could. In fact, I know I've mentioned it before, but it's a known fact that when the queens, and the princesses of Europe wanted to correspond with each other, they were illiterate. They didn't know how to read and write. So they would hire a local woman who could read and write to write their letters for them. And those women were always Jewish, because the only women who were educated in these countries were the Jews, because the Jews always felt that a woman is a human, just like a man. She has the same rights as a man. She has different obligations, but she has human rights, she has civil rights, she has real rights. And therefore, a woman has to be educated just like a man. Right? Not in the same way necessarily, but she has the obligation to be educated, to read, to write, to know advanced concepts, to understand philosophy, to know how to practice Judaism. They have to know that. So therefore, they were educated, while the women in the other cultures were not educated. And therefore we see that advancement. So that's really what it's talking about. And so the answer that I gave is actually from way back then, when Judaism was the most advanced society when it came to this. So that's one of the most common discussions that we find in this topic. And then it switches topics. It continues on this idea of this spiritual sickness, this spiritual thing, right, of that a person gets, right, when something happens. And now it's going to talk about a very specific one. And it starts on the last line on 608 and 609. And it says that Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron. He says, if a person will have on the skin of his flesh a sayes, or a sapachas, or a baheres, and it'll become a tsaras affliction on the skin of his flesh, he shall be brought to Aaron the Kohen, or to one of his sons, the Kohanim. The Kohen shall look at the affliction of the skin of his flesh. If hair in the affliction is changed to white, and the affliction's appearance is deeper than the skin of the flesh, it is a tsaras affliction. The Kohen shall look at it and declare him contaminated. So let's understand what's happening here. The Torah is telling us about a disease which is clearly a spiritual disease. It has a physical effect, but it's a disease for spiritual reasons. The reason that we can see right away that it's not your normal disease is that the Kohen is called the doctor in this case. Not a doctor, but the Kohen does it. The person suddenly finds a spot on their arm, let's say, right? A blemish on their arm, and it has to look in a certain way. And this person says, uh-oh, I don't know what this is. So what would a normal person do? They go to a doctor, check it out. Here it says you should go to the Kohen. And the Kohen will look, and it could be the Kohen will tell you that this is tsaras. Tsaras is a spiritual disease that a person got, and the Kohen, when he's the one who diagnoses it, and as soon as he diagnoses it and he says that's what you have, then that's what you have. Until the Kohen sees it and gives you a diagnosis, it's not considered to be anything. But when he does, this is what happens. Why does a person get this? So the most common answer is that they get it for speaking badly about people. Another reason is the cause of speaking badly, which is called saros ayin, which means mean-spirited. You have a bad eye. You look at people through negatively, and those kind of people get this disease. Right? They get this tsaras. So the Torah is going to go through it, but let me explain outwardly. When it tells us this, it tells us that there's actually 3 levels of this disease. Like say a person speaks badly about someone else. So what will happen is, the first thing will happen is a spot will appear on their house, on the wall of their house. Like a blemish just appears one day. They don't know what it is, so they go and get the Kohen. The Kohen comes and says, yes, this is, or no, this is not a spot from this spiritual sickness. You must have spoke Lashon Hara, and therefore you have this in the house. Now if the person accepts that and changes, fine. They go through a process which we'll explain, but it's over. If the person doesn't and they keep speaking badly, then they will wake up a few days later with a spot on their clothes. There'll be like a blemish, like a stain on their clothes that they're wearing. That there's no basis for the stain. They didn't come into contact with it. It's a spiritual stain. And then they have to go get the Kohen, and the Kohen comes and looks, and he says, yes, you did it again. Now you got it here. Now the person then goes, and a couple of days pass, and the next day, time he gets up, he wakes up, he finds it on his arm, the same spot. He goes to the Kohen says, yep, that's tsaras. You're still talking badly about people, and now it has gone to the highest level, which is it's on your body. You better stop. In other words, it's God's warning us about certain things that we do. As a way to stop us, He inflicts us with this spiritual disease. And the spiritual disease can be cured by way of the Kohen and our repentance. But if we don't, it gets worse. Now, to even add more to it, the Torah explains to us a number of details which are very, very confusing to understand. It begins first with the one on the house. And it says that the one on the house, what happens is that in order to get rid of the spot on your house, it says that you have to take the house apart, piece by piece. That you do the opposite of the builder. If the builder came and put nails into the walls, you got to go and take the nails out of the walls. And take the drywall down. Take everything inside the house out. You have to take your entire house apart and put it back together. When you do that, your house will then be will be no longer have this tsaras. It'll be better. So a person takes all their belongings, puts it in the street, takes apart their house, builds it back up, and then puts their belongings back in. That's what happens. Now, the Medrash tells us that it was very common that when people would take apart their houses, in order to fulfill this idea of getting rid of this tsaras, which they got because they spoke badly, they will often find treasures inside their house. What happened is that the Canaanites who lived in Israel before us, when they saw the Jews coming, they took all their expensive items, like their candlesticks and their jewels, and they hid them in the walls of the house with the understanding that one day they'd come back and get them. Right now the Jews are coming, but the Jews won't know to look in the walls of the house. So we'll just put it there, and then one day we'll come back and get it. So it says that when the Jew takes apart the house, he finds them. So now, this is a very strange medrash, because it's basically telling you that Mr. X goes and he talks bad about another Jew. So God punishes him and puts a spot in his house. And he has to go through this whole terrible process of taking his whole house apart and putting it back together. But then he gets a reward. And the reward is that he finds the treasure inside his house. Now, why should God make it that a guy gets a reward for sinning? right? He sins, okay? In order to get rid of the sin, you've got to take apart your house. All right, it's a lot of work, but you got to do it. But then you could very well get a treasure that you never would have known was there. But why would God do that? Right? I do something bad, God rewards me. That's what it seems like. So it's telling us the following idea: that when a person speaks Lashon Hora, what are they really doing? They're really being small-minded. Instead of looking at another person in a positive way, they're looking at them in a negative way. And they're commenting on them in a negative manner. And by doing that, right, they themselves are injured in that they become negative people. They become cynical. They become the kind of people we all know that you don't want to associate with. They're always negative about everything. And therefore, what do? They become stingy. They become closed-minded. They become, not nice people. And people like that don't want to lend out their stuff. They don't want people to know what they have. They want to stay to themselves. So what happens? They have to take their whole house apart, take all of their belongings and put it in the street. So now everybody knows what they have, right? They're humiliated by this. Everybody knows now. So by virtue of the fact that this person who looked at people badly and went and changes by taking apart their house, so God gives them a reward for going against their nature, for going and doing it. Because what would many people do? They would get this thing on their house. The Kohen would say what it is, and they'd say, too bad. And then they would do it again, and they'd find it on their clothes. And then they do it again, they find it on their arm. So here we see that the person had to take it seriously when he was told by the Kohen and change. And that's not easy. For a person to decide, I'm going to change. I did something wrong. I'm going to change. I'm not going to rationalize and say it was right. I should say this bad thing about the person. No, instead they say, I accept it. I shouldn't have done it. I was wrong. So the fact that the person does that, that's why God's rewarding them. Because they went against their nature and they did that. Right? That's really the basis of it. Right? Then it says when it goes on the person's body, right, then the Kohen has to come again. That's the highest possible level of having it. And it says what happens to such a person is that this person has to be forced to live outside of the city, outside the Jewish area, by himself. And people aren't supposed to go see him. Because if you do, you'll catch it from him. And then you'll have the same problem. So it says that normally what happens with a Jew who's sick, normally there's a mitzvah, the Torah, that says you should go visit the sick. Right? Here, the Torah says you can't visit the sick. You can't visit him. So what is the message is giving us? Is the kind of person who goes and speaks badly about others, right? Is the kind of person who separates himself from others. He says, what do I want to associate with you for? You're not as smart as me. And why do I want to be with you? Right? You're not as nice looking as me. What do I want to be with you? You don't have any money. We can't do anything. Right? They're always talking the negative and the badly about others. So the Torah says, and we're going to teach you by giving you the same thing. We're going to make it that others don't want to associate with you. Because the Torah says you can't go and be with them. So they have to go outside of the city and they have to live by themselves for a period of time, and nobody should visit them. So the person will learn what it's like to separate themselves from the community. The exact same thing they do when they speak badly. When you speak badly about people, what you're doing is separating yourself from the community. Because either people will believe you and this person will be pushed away, or they won't believe you and they'll say you're a bad person for talking that way, and then they won't want to associate with you. So the Torah does it in that way to teach them the lesson as quickly as possible. Right? Then we get into a description of what the spot looks like. And if we see it in verse 4 and 6:11, it says, if it is a white hair on the skin of his flesh, his appearance is not deeper than the skin, and the hair is not changed to white, then the Kohen shall quarantine the affliction for a 7-day period. The Kohen shall look at it on the 7th day, and behold, the affliction retained its color, and the affliction did not spread. Then the Kohen shall quarantine it for a second 7-day period. The Kohen shall look at it again on the 7th day, and behold, if the affliction is dimmed and the affliction is not spread, then the Kohen should declare him pure. If it is mispachas, and it goes through all the different things. So now they're describing what it is that he sees. What he sees in Hebrew is called a nega. Nega means like a wound, right? He has this blemish on his skin, so it's called a nega tzaras, the blemish of tzaras, like it's right here on his skin, let's say. So the word nega is spelled nun gimel ayin, nega, right? And the commentaries tell us an interesting thing. that if you want the word for nega, which is a negative word, it means a wound, right? That a person gets from the spiritual disease, is the opposite of joy. And how do you spell joy? Is ayin nun gimel. It's the same three letters in the opposite direction. Nega and oneg are opposite each other, right? They're opposite. They're the same letters, but they're opposite. And so the commentaries find this very interesting, right? That joy, happiness, oneg Shabbos, right? We have oneg Shabbos is you eat something that you like, you enjoy Shabbos. Oneg is joy, and nega, which is negative spot, have the same thing, except the main difference is that the ayin, the letter ayin, in oneg is in the beginning of the word, and the letter ayin in nega is at the end of the word. That's the difference. So now, with that understanding, the Torah says that the Kohen comes, right, and he wants to see what it is, and it says that he sees it v'lo hifoch es eino. He sees that the appearance of this blemish has not changed, and therefore it's bad, right? So it says, but lo hifach es eino. It's a funny expression. It means did not reverse its eye. It means its appearance, how it looks. But ayin, eino, it means eye. It also means the letter ayin, right? The letter ayin. So here the Kohen comes and he says, "You're tameh. You can't. You sinned. You can't go into the temple until you go outside of the community, right? Like I just described, because the spot did not change its ayin, its look. So what happens if you change the ayin? Now we're going to do a play on words. Nega and oneg. The difference is where the ayin is, the letter ayin. If you have the letter ayin at the end of the word, it's a nega. It's a disease, a spot. If you have the letter ayin at the beginning of the word, it's a joy. So if the word did not change from having it at the end to having it at the beginning, so it's still tameh, it's still not good. That's what the Kohen says, right? However, when we talk about a person who is like small-eyed, right? It's not evil-eyed, but small-eyed. Like we would say here that the person is small-minded. That is that they only see things their way. They don't understand other things. They don't understand other people. Either you do it my way or there's something wrong with your way, right? That's how the small-minded people are. That's the same thing here. A person who has a small eye, so to speak, an ayin, right, is a person who never has joy in life. They always see the negativity. They always see what's bad. So it says in this commentary in the Kedusha Arim, the person didn't switch the ayin. He didn't switch, and he looks at the world as a nega. The whole world is a wound, rather than looking at the world as a joy, as oneg. Why? Because he didn't switch the ayin from the end of the word to the beginning of the word. Right? Again, it's a play on words. The point being that if you really want to be, right, all you have to do is change your outlook. If you change your outlook from being a negative person, a cynical person, a person who never thinks anything will work, who's always making, being the devil's advocate all the time, that person, right, has a nega, has a spot, a blemish. But if you're a person who looks at others and you see the good in the other people, even though there are flaws, and you see the world as a good place that we can help make better, so then it's an oneg, it's a joy, because you've reversed where the ayin is. So that's a play on words, but it works very well to understand this concept. Okay. So then it goes through more examples of this sickness, this charas, in all different ways, and where it'll appear in different parts of the body, and then what happens to such a person. We've gone through all that. So let's take a look at the next parsha that we're doing, because it's two of them. The next one is Metzora. Now Metzora, the reason that they put these two parshas together is besides the fact that right now, because how the calendar fell, and we have an extra day of Passover that Israel doesn't, and that day was a Saturday, so Israel is reading one parsha ahead of us. Right? Last week we read a Shmini, and they already read Tazria, that we're going to read this week. So in order to put us together, so we read two parshas, right? In order for us to get ahead one. That way, starting next week, we'll be in the same place as them. But this one, the reason they put certain parsha together is they have similar ideas. This parsha is very similar to the one we just finished discussing, as far as all of the laws of this spiritual sickness. But it tells us right in the beginning, how do you, there's all different things that we already said that you have to do to get rid of it, but one of the things that you have to give is sacrifice. So here it talks about the sacrifice that you have to give, and it says, right in the beginning, Hashem says to Moshe, this shall be the law of the Metzora on the day of his purification. He shall be brought to the Kohen shall go to the outside of the camp, right? And the Kohen shall command, and the person being purified there shall have 2 live clean birds, and so forth. The Kohen shall command, and the Kohen shall command, and the one bird shall be slaughtered in an earthenware vessel. As for the live bird, he shall take it with the cedar wood and with crimson thread and the hyssop, and he shall dip the live bird into the blood, and the bird that was slaughtered over the spring water, and then it goes on. So here you have these 2 birds. Why? There are many sacrifices. We have cows, we have lambs, we have goats, right? We have all types of sacrifices. We have flour. Here we have a sacrifice of a bird. Now, normally, the purpose of offering a bird is a sacrifice. It's usually because a person doesn't have enough money for a larger sacrifice. In other words, God said everybody who needs to offer sacrifices should be able to do it, regardless of how much money they have, because it's part of our spiritual need. In order to make it possible, somebody without money, instead of offering a cow, can often offer a bird. And if you can't afford a bird, you can often offer flour. But here, the original sacrifice is a bird. No matter how much money you have, you give a bird. So they ask why. And the commentaries tell us that if the original reason for getting the sickness is that you speak bad about people, then you're acting like a bird. That is, a bird goes from one tree to the next tree to the third tree, and it makes noise in all the trees, right? It's like a person who goes from one person to the next and talks bad about everybody. I come to you and I say something, and then I see some other people and go over there and say, did you hear about this guy, what he did? And then I go over there and tell that one, right? You go from place to place to place like a bird. So they use the bird to send that message and to atone for what the person did themselves. That's why you have this one of a bird. Let's see what else we got. So we talked about the house one, what happens there. So here in the coming in the last few pages on 628 and so forth, we talk about other types of spiritual illnesses that people would get. We should understand today that we don't have these diseases anymore. And the reason is because our spiritual level has fallen so much that it wouldn't have an effect on us. For instance, if every time we spoke Lashon Hora, we'd get a spot on our house, and then we'd have to take our house apart. When you imagine how often people do speak badly about others, and how you could do it 100 times in a day, therefore then what happens is that everyone's house would be taken apart and put back together constantly. It wouldn't work anymore. It's just people are too far gone. It's sort of like, we had that fight, we lost, now let's have a different fight. People are, right, so what happens is that as time goes on and our spiritual levels drop from the earlier days, also these diseases disappear. Because you could imagine if I'd come to you and I'd say, if you ever talk bad about somebody, you're going to get a spot on your house. And you're going to say, oh, that's ridiculous. We come up with such a thing. And you speak bad about someone and a spot appears on your house. And then on your clothes and then on your arm. Just like I tell you. Right? What would happen is if it actually did, then people would start following the Torah. But not because they believed in it. Because they didn't want to get punished. Right? So that's not what we're looking for in Judaism. We're not looking to have situations where people follow the Torah because they have no choice. They're supposed to follow the Torah because they have choice. Right? So that's what happens. That's one of the ideas behind it. So some of these other sicknesses, also you have, right, it talks here about menstruation, a woman who has a discharge, right, that's blood, that she becomes tameh. You have a man that it talks about that he has a spiritual mission, Right, just like when a person, right, normally they have an emission, let them semen when they have relations. Here we're talking about where the person has one, but it's not the same thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's physical, but it's for a spiritual reason. That's called a zav. And we don't have this today either, because if we would have these type of spiritual sicknesses, we wouldn't know how to deal with it. We've really sunk too low. If we look, right, the Zav and the Zava, that's on 633, and it also talks about the woman who's a Nida. The word Nida, by the way, does not have anything to do with blood. The word Nida means that she's outside. Because what happens is anybody who is in this situation is put outside the camp. In other words, they would live outside the camp for a certain number of days until they could come back in. It's not a punishment. It's dealing with a reality. Living outside the camp does not mean you live in jail. It means that you don't live among the others, because otherwise you come in contact with other people, you'll affect their ability to go into the temple. So they separate her. Right? So basically much of what the parsha is going over. There are some other interesting points, but I think the main thing to get from this is this is the first real discussion we have about the laws of Tuma and Tahara. Now I'm using the Hebrew words, but Tahara means that you are spiritually able. You're tahor, or clean, right? Again, it doesn't mean clean. Clean is a physical word, and this is a spiritual thing. And Tuma is the lack of holiness, which is a spiritual thing as well, which is often translated as unclean. But it has nothing to do with unclean, because it's not dirt, it's not physical. So a person who is tameh, as we all are today, is not allowed to enter the temple and do certain things. A person who is tahor, who nobody is today, does have that ability. And being tameh or tahor has nothing to do with reward and punishment, or good or bad. It has to do with reality. Like I said, a woman who gives birth becomes tameh. She can't go into the temple, right? Who would a woman or a man who buries someone, right? That they walk down the street, they find a dead body on the street. That people, whatever reason, nobody was there to bury him, and they bury him. Or they have a loved one, so someone dies in their family and they bury them. They become tameh, but they only did the best mitzvah. So tameh has nothing to do with being punished. It has to do with the reality. When you come into contact with the dead, you're not allowed to enter into the temple. It's very similar to the reason why we wash our hands when we leave a cemetery. You notice that? It's symbolic that we're washing our hands like as if we're going through this process, because we were among the dead. And being among the dead has this tumah, because what is a cemetery? It's a place where dead bodies are. Dead bodies have no personality. Right? There's no sense of humor. There's no intelligence with a dead body. Why? Because your intelligence, your sense of humor, your personality are all representations of your soul. And when you die, your soul leaves your body, so your personality leaves as well. Right? So you go in among them, right, among the dead, right, who have lost their potential. You will also lose a certain amount of your potential. So that is a punishment. It's just the reality, right? If you eat sugary food, it makes you all nervous. If you drink coffee, it wakes you up. If you go among the dead, you are not allowed to enter the temple. It's not a punishment, it's just a fact of reality. And that's why they say this. Okay. So that's really pretty much what it deals with, and the rest are pretty much details here. But there is one interesting point I can tell you. It does have in the book of Devarim, which we won't get to for a number of months, it does have a reference to this idea here. And it says that a person should be careful not to do things that will cause them to get this tsaras, the sickness, like speaking badly. And then it says, and you should remember about Miriam, the sister of Moshe, and how God punished her in the desert. So what does one have to do with the other? What it's talking about here is that when Miriam spoke bad about her brother on one occasion, what happened was that Moshe's wife was telling Moshe's sister and brother, Aaron and Miriam, she was telling them that Moshe doesn't have relations with her anymore. That he came down from Mount Sinai and he's a changed person. He doesn't have relations. So both Aaron and Miriam are prophets also, and they still had relations. So Miriam criticized Moshe and said, Moshe couldn't. He's acting too big for himself. He should have relations with his wife. His wife's a person. She needs this closeness, right? He should do that. And she spoke badly about him. Now, she didn't want to. It wasn't supposed to be bad. It was trying to be good. It was trying to help, but she made a mistake. Because of it, it says that she got this saras, and she had to go outside the camp. And it says, though, as a reward for her, because she waited for her brother when he was born, that he shouldn't drown in the Nile. So Hashem made all the Jewish people wait for her as she was outside the camp for a week before they could go, right? They could go away. On that basis, right, as she does that, that's where we have to ask a question. Here Miriam sins, right? Even if she didn't mean to. She's punished by being put outside the camp with this sickness. And the Jewish people, as a reward to her, have to wait for her. Well, I don't know about you, but if I was her, I wouldn't want an entire nation of people to wait around for me while I'm being punished for sinning. Right? They don't all need to know. They don't all need to wait for me. So how is it a reward for her? So the idea is that Miriam's example of speaking badly, where she was punished, is the perfect example because she didn't mean anything bad. Moshe wasn't hurt by what she said because he's a humble person. There was no harm done in any way at all by what she said, and nevertheless she's still punished for speaking badly. So because she was set as the example that if even she's punished, then everyone is punished. If that's the case, then Miriam, would have there would be a difference in her case, because she would be the perfect example of showing you of someone who didn't mean it, nothing bad came of it, and you could rationalize it. Say, look, I know I spoke badly, but nothing happened. No, they still get punished for that. You can't speak badly. So because of that, the people had to wait for her because they needed to learn that even in this case, where nothing bad happened, and Miriam just made a mistake, that's all she did. She didn't really sin in the way that most people do when they speak badly. Nevertheless, she still had to go outside the camp. All of the people needed to know that. So therefore, she receives a reward in that everyone is going to learn from her, and they're all going to know that she didn't do something really terrible, but still, even if you have good intentions, you can't speak badly. Like they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Very often you want to do the right thing and you do the wrong thing. God takes it into account, as he does with Miriam, but there's still a reality that you do something wrong, you're going to have to be punished for it. So she wanted that lesson to be learned by the Jewish people. So that was really the message there. So I think with that, we'll a few minutes early, but we'll stop with that, and we continue next week with Parshas Acharei. All right. I hope that we'll run into everybody at shul this week, and they'll come by and see us. Okay.
Thank you.